Hello, and thank you for joining me on the same drugs. I really appreciate your time. I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it too.
So I listened to your interview with Megan Dom, and I really appreciated it and was sort of intrigued by. I hadn't heard of your podcast until then, and I listened to it, and it was very well done. And I guess I appreciated someone really kind of delving into the topic of incels in a more complex and in some ways, a more compassionate way, I suppose, because I think that the term incel gets thrown around a lot, and that a lot is blamed on incels, and I'm not sure how much people actually understand the incel community. I mean, I personally don't know that much about the incel community, although I've interacted with some of these people online. But I wonder if you can just start by telling me about that term. Where did the term incel come from? How long has this been around for?
So the incel primer, incel 101. I give this, I try to keep it fresh each time because I do talk about it a lot. But the term, it is called what's called a portmanteau, two words that are put together. And the words are involuntary celibate. So these are people who define themselves by their involuntary celibacy, their inability to be sexually or romantically partnered or active despite wanting to be. And the term actually came around more than 20 years ago now. In 1998, I think the late 90s, it was actually a female, a student, queer girl named Alana Boltwood, who was doing a project for a university. I think she's Canadian. I think she was somewhere in Ontario, and she wanted to study loneliness for a class, so she started something called the Involuntary Celibate Project, and she had people sort of talking about their experiences. And it wasn't misogynistic, it wasn't, gendered, it wasn't anything really, it was her project. But after the project was, I think she gave it up at some point, the little community she created kind of remained. And then the term sort of got co-opted 10 years later than that. And, it became this new thing, which it is now, that I think has, not that much to do with the original term. It's just kind of, the one that stuck for it. But that's what, that's the etymology of the word. And today it's used both by incels, these men primarily who identify this way and the kind of culture they've formed, and people who want to talk about terrorists and extremists and, the danger of the manosphere, and also just by young people as kind of a catch-all pejorative insult for a loser.
Yeah, and I mean, it is used as a kind of catch-all insult for a loser. It certainly implies that you're a loser in society. Why would anybody identify as an incel?
Well, because they can relate to it. It's kind of a basic set theory thing. Like, there are many people who are incel, but who are not incels, who don't identify that way. But the people that do are people that probably sought it out at some point, looked up, why can't I get laid, or certain kind of characteristics about themselves, and found this community and these ideas that on the one hand might be pretty unpleasant and might not be things that people would want to identify with. But if people are struggling with that and feel like they can't talk about it openly or honestly, reading things like this might seem like, oh, here's the truth. Now I can maybe understand myself and what's going on with me a little bit. And so in that sense, it's it becomes kind of an identity for some people. Being involuntarily celibate isn't the only thing, you know, that a lot of people kind of, when they don't know much about this community, say things like, why are these people so obsessed with sex and life isn't all about that? Well, first of all, that is a very big part of life for most people, both culturally and biologically and in every other way. So I think that's kind of, you know, not fair. But then it's not really just about sex. It is kind of in the spirit of the original usage of the term, about loneliness and not fitting in.
Right. And I mean, like, and either way, it is a big deal. And I do think that people kind of brush off the struggle of, I mean, we can talk about men specifically, maybe men specifically, that men who can't meet women, don't have access to sex, again, feel like sort of losers or outcasts. You know, they seem to think of themselves as they're in this position that they can't get out of because, you know, they're not tall enough, they don't make enough money, they're not attractive enough, they're not successful enough. And you'll hear, and, you know, like, I don't know, maybe I was the kind of person who used to do something like this, but you'll hear people be like, oh, well, too bad. Like, be a man, or like, well, if you can't get sex, it's not the end of the world. You're not going to die without sex. But I really think that, I mean, this is like a major part of life, like relationships. And if you're heterosexual, relationships with the opposite sex, like sexual fulfillment is really a big deal. But I guess, I mean, is it true? Like, are these guys just losers? Is there something kind of inherently wrong with these men, or are they just feeling sorry for themselves?
I certainly don't think that there's something inherently wrong with them, but I think that sometimes their belief or their argument that the things that are quote unquote wrong with them or that make them not popular and unsuccessful romantically, sometimes there are sort of their immutable traits that make people make people judge them or put them, you know, at sort of a disadvantage. With dating, certainly, I think it's crazy to deny that, you know, that somebody's height or generally how attractive they are, their appearance, how conventionally attractive they are, and certain other traits make somebody more or less desirable to the opposite sex and, you know, have more of a pick in the dating market. So, you know, I don't think there's something inherently wrong with them. I think that for some of them, it's a phase. I think that many of them probably, or most of them. And I think that also a lot of them have personalities, just kind of characterological similarities to each other that make them kind of nerdy or awkward, and also drawn to very rigid kind of explanations for things, which this community provides. And, you know, that combined, you know, for a lot of them with something in their upbringing, I don't know, some kind of conflict or lack of connection with parents, that there's a lot of that. And just they're disempowered people. And there's all sorts of reasons. A lot of them certainly have a lot of mental health issues and struggles, depression and anxiety, you know, overwhelmingly they have that. You know, and that's kind of a chicken or the egg thing sometimes, whether their circumstances make them depressed or whether their depression worsens their circumstances, and it's kind of a, you know, self-perpetuating as depression is. But yeah, it's a type of guy, I would say. And there are exceptions to this. There's people that are incel for kind of other reasons, but for the most part, there is a type of guy that is likely to be this guy. And I think everybody knows that guy, you know, whatever generation you are, you know, this is sort of a ubiquitous type. And they have always existed, I think. I think that for myriad factors, a lot of them technological, social media, dating app, things like that. Maybe it's a little bit more pronounced now and they can talk to each other. But this kind of community is new.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has struck me about these kinds of guys and my interactions with them in, the comment sections and things like that. So I'm saying like incels, like men going their own way, MGTOW or whatever, the people, like the pickup artists, is that I mean, as much as like, yeah, I have compassion for guys who are lonely, who can't connect with people, who want touch and sexual connection and can't find that. At the same time, I find that they often have like a super diluted idea about how, not just how women are, but how men are too, like and you were talking to, what was his name? Incel Sergeant or something like that.
Sarge.
Yeah. And, this idea that women primarily go for attraction first is not true. Like, and I can say that from my own experience. Like, I've been in long-term relationships with men who, when I first met them, I didn't find them attractive. Like, I didn't find them disgusting, but I wasn't attracted to them. And it was sort of like I got to know them, and then I became attracted to them.
Yep.
Certainly, I've not made choices about the men that I date or who I'm attracted to based on their, their income or anything like that. And they talk about women as though it's like one-dimensional. I'm like, have you just learned about women from like movies or just from talking amongst yourself in these Reddit threads? Like, it's as if you've never even met a woman in real life.
Yeah. A lot of them barely have. Say from their mothers, they don't have female friends. They have very little life experience. I mean, all of this chatter, all of these observations, these hypotheses, they're based not from life experience. That's kind of something that a lot of them have in common. Again, there are exceptions to that, but those exceptions are different. They don't talk the same way as the other ones do. And then the way that they talk is also exaggerated and kind of reductive from their real opinion, just for the sake of kind of regurgitating whatever the material is, or I don't know, whatever it is that people get out of, saying the same thing over and over and over again in echo chambers. And obviously lots of people just get so much out of that. But they don't really go as far as that in their actual opinions. And when you speak to them one-on-one, either just meaning one of them outside of their in-group, they're pretty different. And when they actually speak to women, they don't think of the women they're speaking to as these cartoon characters that they describe. So, there's a lot of just, as they call it, shit posting and edgelording and irony, and what they say ought to be taken with a grain of salt. There are some of them that don't do that.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, even I can't remember his name, but you were talking to another guy who you obviously were trying to challenge a little bit, and he didn't really seem like he was going for it. But to challenge this idea that all men, for example, I mean, like I said, like it's as though they don't know any women, but it's also as though they don't know any men. That men are only interested in women who are like 20, and once you're over 30, you're like washed up and nobody wants you anymore. And any woman who has been in their 30s or is even older, like I'm 41, and that's just never been my experience. Like I've never had trouble meeting or dating or interacting with men. I've never felt washed up or unwanted. And it's like men in their 40s date other women or date other people in their 40s or in their 30s, and men in their 50s date women in their 40s and 50s. And like, I don't know, maybe things get harder, but it's just like, I'm just like, what planet are you people living on?
Yeah, well, I consider most of them are, in their 20s, at the most. And the ones that are older sound different. Once they get into their 30s, they don't talk that way anymore. But you have to realize, you're talking to a group of sometimes very intelligent, in a way, like well-read, and they're, they can really follow sort of a train of thought and do research and pretty diligently, but very little context or life experience, not just romantically, but in every way. So it's like, sometimes it's pretty childish.
And is it true? I mean, obviously the common understanding or stereotype about these guys is that they're all misogynists and they hate women. Did you find that to be true in talking to some of these guys and in reading their threads online and things like that?
Again, okay, so you know how today we have definitions for racism, for bigotry, and things that are, there's two kind of types of them. There's the definition that assumes intent on the part of the perpetrator, the offender. And in that definition, according to that definition, if someone's not actually thinking about one's race or gender or whatever it is and thinking you're lesser because of it, then it's not necessarily racist, even if they say something that might sound that way. And then in the other, you're perpetuating, if you're saying something to perpetuate the, oppression of a certain group, even if you're ignorant of what you're saying, it counts. I feel like with a lot of incels, they say things that would meet misogynism, the definition for that, according to the second standard, but not the first. Like, they make sweeping generalizations that are not flattering, but they're not thinking any of it when they talk to women, actually, one-on-one. Whether it's some of their friends that they have, or just me as a woman, or women that they're talking about that they kind of like, they kind of drop it all.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I had assumed about these guys. I assumed that they would be these bitter men who identified as incels and felt like all women were seeking somebody of higher quality than them and they were doomed to loneliness for the rest of their lives. And, and actually, I mean, one of the things that I've always sort of thought that it was like, well, I was like, maybe it's possible that you guys are all seeking these women who you think exist because you don't really know any women. So you want this woman who's like this beautiful, perfect, sexy woman, and you're never going to get that woman. So you may as well just give up on life and give up on trying to find a woman. And I was like, why don't you try to find a woman that's like more on your level, which sounds mean, but it's like, why don't you find a woman that maybe you get along with, or maybe isn't this like porn star looking woman, or whatever it is that you think this beautiful, perfect woman is.
Yeah, I don't really find that that's the case with a lot of them. I've considered that before. I think that sometimes it is, like, there's a handful of times that I've seen that. But for the most part, I think that they would be, they're not like, they don't have these unrealistic expectations of what a woman should look like or want a porn star or anything like that. They do seem like they would be very open to just, a nice girl. And they're just really depressed, and they have difficulty socially, and they can't take rejection well. And, there's a lot of kind of inertia, like failure to launch. There's not really a lot of trying in earnest, or knowing how. I think a lot of them also miss cues, when someone is interested. And they're just so afraid of rejection. And then if they get the slightest indication that they will be rejected, they drop everything. They sort of just step back. But I don't think it's true that they want like porn stars or anything like that. They're just, I don't know, a lot of them are just really, really depressed.
Mm-hmm. And some of them, it sounds like, I mean, you mentioned mental health issues, but some of them, it sounds like, is there a high percentage of autistic guys within this community?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Staggering percentage. Polls of one of their biggest communities that remains now show something like 20% have a formal diagnosis of autism spectrum. On a pretty big sample size too, like 500 or something responses, which is just staggering compared to, you know, the 1 or 2% in the general population. And then another 20 or 25% on top of that think that they might be and aren't diagnosed. And that's really common too, because, you know, since we got rid of the Asperger's syndrome designation and made it a spectrum, to be diagnosed with autism, it doesn't really happen after a certain point in childhood because it's a developmental disorder. And if you're not presenting with those symptoms and you are high functioning or Asperger's, then it's just not as common that someone would be diagnosed, because you really have to look for it, you know, and it's based on a lot kind of more subtle symptoms. But that's a huge, even if it's just the 20% or just a third or so, that's a huge percentage of a community. And it makes sense because, you know, these are people that have trouble with social cues, and they also are drawn to black and white thinking and kind of hyper focus on a topic and these scientific explanations of everything, or pseudoscientific sometimes. But yeah, it's very prevalent, and almost more than half of the ones I talked to for the show, which is like, you know, 50 or 60 by now, are on the spectrum.
Why did you become interested in this particular topic? Why did you decide to cover incels in podcast form?
Well, I didn't. I don't think I didn't know where it would go. I was listening to true crime podcasts at the time, and I was really liking those and this medium for storytelling, especially in that genre, because with journalism, you know, you can hear from the subjects and tell your story that way. And I thought this was interesting too, because it's like a population that has a lot of body dysmorphia, I think, or they don't really show their faces. So just doing it audio seemed like a natural fit. And I think I just thought that it was interesting, and that maybe I would do like a 10 episode season or something with one character, and it wouldn't really be so in depth or so much about the community, or that I'd start, you know, basically researching it. I didn't plan on doing that. I thought it would be the, you know, the premise for more of like a character study.
I mean, and I know that a lot of people express concerns about these guys, not just because they believe them to be misogynist, but they sort of see them as guys who've been radicalized, like extremist guys. And a lot of that has to do with men like, you know, Elliot Rodger and Alex Manassian. And I wonder, I mean, do you think that this identification or community is dangerous? Do you think that there's guys in this community that are particularly dangerous, more so than, I don't know, any other man?
No, I really don't. I can say that 100% confidence at this point. I don't. I think that there are troubled men in the world today with our culture, that most of them, if you look at there's only a handful to begin with, and some of them are not even legitimately associated with incels, but the ones that exist, these attackers were fascinated with mass killers from a young age, had all these other factors, loads of other kind of distal and proximal factors, as they're known, to set them on their downward spiral. And I believe that they, you know, it probably didn't help them, but I don't think that the content radicalized them. I think that these are people that would have found some ideology to give their, whatever they were going to do, their atrocity that they were going to commit, more meaning. They want to ascribe purpose to it. But I just haven't seen any evidence of it radicalizing them. I actually think that a lot of these very lonely and isolated young men, when they get into communities, there's, you know, people, it's hard to recognize when I'm not familiar with it, but as heinous as some of the jokes are, they still are jokes, and it's venting a bit, you know, and I just don't see it leading people to commit these killings. I've written about that a lot, so, you know, I don't want to sort of beat a dead horse too much, but no, I don't think so.
What do you think is one of the main things that people misunderstand about incels?
I think what people misunderstand, besides just the intention of what they say and kind of the meaning behind it, is that, you know, it's given this weight, like you've joined this belief that's so odious, and it's hard for people to imagine. And what I misunderstand about the misunderstanding is not getting it, is not getting that if you're like a young person that feels like a loser and feels lonely, that you wouldn't be drawn to a place where there was kind of endless analysis of that and a bit of, you know, throwing blame onto society or the designated enemy, whether that's women or chads or whatever, rather than yourself, especially when these things are not, for some reason, not things that we talk about openly. You know, we don't openly have conversations about, oh, well, if you're not as attractive or if you're socially awkward, then you might have a hard time with this, and that'll probably be pretty painful for you. People aren't honest about that. So if somebody asks about it pretty innocently, not knowing what kind of answer they'll get as a young person, and many of these guys do, and a lot of even these Elliot Rodgers and stuff, you know, they detailed kind of accounts of their lives and talk about asking their parents and things, and they feel like nobody's being straight with them. So when you feel like something's taboo, but you're sure that nobody's telling you the truth about something, I think that if you then find something that seems like an honest explanation for it, it's a lot easier to accept anything else you get from that source. And that leaves people susceptible to having more extreme views. And while I don't think that their views are, you know, very rarely actually going to mobilize anyone to violence, I do think that they're just not healthy to hold for a lot of them. For someone who's depressed, I think they could make that worse and kind of keep them stuck. For some people, I think it helps, or, you know, it doesn't have effect on them, positive or negative. But I don't know. I think it's just people don't look at them as kind of questioning, struggling young people. And that's what a lot of them are.
So, I mean, do you think this is a new phenomenon? I mean, obviously the term is relatively new, but I mean, has this problem always been around, and now there's just a name for it, and there's like a specific online community, and that's why we're talking about this now?
For the most part, yes, I think. I do think it's always been around. On the other hand, I think that, you know, there's a few variables here. I think that with social media and dating apps and our culture, which is also very sexualized, there's more pressure to fit in, to look good. You know, everybody's presenting this 2D image of their lives. And I think that people are also less connected to each other because of a lot of these things. I think that people are less sort of forgiving of differences. You know, I think conformity at that age, you know, high school and so on, is probably more, you know, kind of like you have to be narrower fit. So I think there's a little bit more pressure to be happy, to fit in, to be popular. And then I think that we're also in a very kind of identitarian time. And that adds another layer to this, where this is young men, they're misogynists, they're on the wrong side of history, you know, so we can't have any empathy for them because they are privileged. And a lot of people also, you know, visualize like a disaffected white teen when in reality half of their community's not white. which is actually overrepresenting, considering that it's mostly in Europe and North America. But, I think that it is kind of something that has just ramped up, as has everything in the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's become very easy and popular to say like, oh, white men, white men, white men, and to talk about male entitlement, which is not to say that there isn't such a thing as male entitlement, but I think that they chalk this whole phenomenon in particular and these kinds of communities, they chalk it all up to male entitlement, and it's tied into. I remember Jordan Peterson said something that was misinterpreted to mean like that he felt like
monogamy thing, right?
Yeah, like where every man was owed a wife, a woman, which is not what he said, of course. But I think that people think that these guys believe that it's like, oh, well, you should just be handing me a wife. It doesn't matter what women want. I'm entitled to a woman. I'm entitled to sex, kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's not the case. A lot of them talk like that and are joking, most of them. And then some of them are young cells, as they call them, the sort of really young ones. Some of them might talk like that and not know what the hell they're talking about and think they mean it, but there's not very much behind it. Most of them that are, a little bit older, or even some, I talk to a lot of them that are in their early 20s and are extremely mature and articulate, not misogynistic at all, by the way. There are many of those. They don't believe that at all. They just talk about how, ideally everybody would have, or there wouldn't be such a difficult barrier to getting a relationship, and they bring in all kinds of cultural trends and things like that, but very few of them actually literally think that way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and what do you think would help these guys? Like if you were going to give them advice to like kind of, I don't know, make them happier really, and maybe hopefully find connection and maybe hopefully find a partner. I mean, what could they be doing, or what should they be doing in your opinion? Is there anything?
I really do think that, and this is the type of advice that they get sometimes that they call blue pill normie advice, that they get from the more well-meaning strangers, or sometimes not well-meaning, that say things like get a hobby, or work out or something. Like, yes, those are platitudes, but I do think that a lot of them have creativity, they're intelligent. I can see sometimes that they just lack positive, reinforcement in other areas of their life. It's just the same advice that I guess you would give to anyone to be a little bit happier. That's what and then they'll say, no, it doesn't matter because that's not going to get me a girlfriend, and I don't need to be happier. I need a girl, and it's like, well, if you were happier, if you were more engaged in life, if you were more interested in something you were doing, and if you just felt better about living life every day and yourself, then it probably would go a long way to actually drawing someone to you and allowing for a connection to happen. If you find some hobby, like, you can meet people that way. But I refrain from giving direct advice now because I think that it tarnishes my my rapport with them a little bit. I don't want to say that I have the answers. I don't want to say that there is definitely someone for everyone, because unfortunately that's probably not true. So I think finding some meaning in life that is within your control, that's not dependent on someone else, is a good start. And if that's really, really impossible to do, then, you probably would benefit from, I don't know, looking into some kind of mental health treatment or something, because that sounds like, that could be quite severe depression. And I know many that are stuck in that, and that's pretty difficult.
Mm-hmm. Like the kind of person who just kind of has no hope for life or no hope for joy in life. That's a pretty intense thing to feel in the long term.
Yeah.
Did you get backlash for, like, do people, I mean, probably feminists, I guess I could say specifically, for being do people think that you're overly compassionate to these guys when you should be more critical or harsher or something like that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I frequently get, really bad reviews that say things like that. They call me an apologist, that say that I don't push back, that I just drank the Kool-Aid. After my trailer was released on my podcast network, they got messages not to, release the show and kind of tried to cancel it in advance. Yeah. This one journalist, former journalist, whose name I will not be saying here, maybe, was kind of the leader of it. And I found that it was interestingly, a lot of the accounts, the Twitter accounts that were calling for this were also Antifa accounts. So there was a connection there. Mm-hmm. I guess it was, I don't know, but I guess it's kind of the same neighborhood. A lot of people, in the counterterrorism and CVE, that's the industry, countering violent extremism that, exists to sort of preempt terrorist attacks ostensibly, and now deals with domestic issues. So racist kind of extremist groups, and now that's what they call male supremacist groups. People from that field early on kind of made a connection between incels and the alt-right, which is not entirely founded. There is some crossover in the language, and for many reasons, just kind of the platforms that would allow the content to, exist was one, like where they would be housed. These movements kind of both came together with 4chan, so there's this culture in common, but it's not like I don't think it is a gateway to the alt-right.
So did you get an impression of how permanent this incel state is? Does it seem more like a temporary thing for most of these guys, or did they kind of get stuck in this mindset for a long period of time?
It's difficult to say, because unless you have a personal relationship with them, if someone quote unquote ascends, that's their word for graduating out of inceldom, you're unlikely to hear from them or see their content on any of the forums, because they're no longer really allowed there. So, you don't see a lot of those stories, kind of existing, but there are some kind of like public former incels. And just from what I observe, from ones that I do know in person that I spoke to, not for the show or anything, there are many that kind of, it's temporary for, it is a phase. Everybody, I guess, is temporarily incel at one point, before you start being sexually active. And then that's over. But there are definitely some that are middle-aged or older and are still incel, or just, in their 30s. And it is really sad when there are stories like that, because a lot of these guys, especially when they're older, they moderate a lot, and they're very actually introspective, and they're reasonable, and they don't blame anyone. And they have this almost like Zen view of life. I've had some of those on my show. And it's just, I don't ask for their photographs. I don't know what they look like. I don't know a lot of their, personally identifying information. But just from speaking to them, they're really good people, smart, interesting, kind of observant and interested. And it's sad that they are alone.
And did you find, do a lot of them feel really misunderstood and kind of maligned? I mean, I know that, I think their Reddit forum got shut down. They're often being banned. do they feel like they're constantly being represented? Are they misrepresented? Are they angry about that?
Yeah, a lot of them are. Some of them are just frustrated with it. Some of them actively want to change that perception. Some of them get a kick out of it because they're kind of like trolls, and then yet another small portion of them probably prefer being seen as dangerous or a boogeyman to just a loser, invisible.
Mm-hmm.
So they maybe embrace that a little bit. I remember when I first started my show, I would get followed by all these incel accounts that just always have really kind of funny names and, like a anime avatar or something blank. And I remember seeing one saying, "Not crazy about the rebrand." And I thought that was kind of clever and funny. They don't want to be necessarily shown in a more sympathetic light. But yeah, a lot of them are very distrustful of me, of outsiders, of anyone, of media, certainly of any kind of efforts to like look into their community or try to offer help. A lot are very distrustful of the mental health system. And yes, I think that being maligned and the scrutiny that has come about as a result of these media stories and these cases and the associations made, rightly or not, is not helping. I think, it's close to directly making a problem in some cases where there isn't, because so many of these types of attacks are copycats and probably wouldn't happen at all if it weren't for the coverage given to some of these.
Like, you think that these guys who commit this kind of violence see the attention that these guys got in the media and want that attention also?
I know they do, yeah. That's definitely the motivation for some of those actors. Actually, your court, with the Alec Manassian case, the judge, Justice Anne Malloy, made a really wise and important, I think, and eloquent ruling when she, convicted him. And I don't remember the whole thing, but she just said something about, basically, I want to make it known, she didn't use his name, that this is a killer who is autistic, not an autistic killer. I'm not even going to address the incel issue because I think this person just wants more notoriety and I'm not going to give it to him. This was not ideologically motivated. Like, this was just, and I think that was wise. I don't know what exactly somebody like that wants, but I think they don't see life or the world as like a real thing. It's like a video game almost. And, it's definitely seeing themselves as something. There's a lot of narcissism too in those attackers, and a feeling of being like, brilliant and not recognized, special.
What would you like to see in terms of how people approach these guys who identify as incels, both in the media, but just sort of in terms of how they're spoken about online? I mean, what would be more helpful, I suppose, or more useful, more productive, more realistic?
I think being realistic would be more realistic. I think that not saying, not giving this is even, I'll start by not using it as a pejorative. Not everybody needs to weigh in. Don't make this connection between incels and killers when you're talking about a community that is probably bigger than people realize in terms of how many people identify that way or are, incel curious or something, like kind of check it out and lurk the forums a little bit, but maybe aren't all the way there. I think there's probably a lot of people that end up there at some point, more than people realize. And they're certainly not all or nearly, hardly any of them violent or even hateful, so that's not true. Dispense with that. Calling it terrorism. So just not being, so cruel about this. And I do see, we live in an era where there's so much awareness and empathy and sensitivity, and inclusivity talked about all the time. And we're really not supposed to be okay with judging people or thinking that they're less than based on immutable traits or being, not being neurotypical, being neurodivergent. And a lot of these people are. And maybe some people believe that men throughout history have had all the power, but some clearly don't have any power. And I think these guys are the definition of disempowered. So I think, yeah.
Which is sort of goes counter to the narrative where we pretend that all men are empowered and women are disempowered by comparison, but perhaps that's a whole other topic.
Yeah.
So tell us how people can find and listen to your podcast.
So my podcast is just called Incel, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts, basically.
I listened on Spotify.
That's a good one. One of my
Okay, well, thanks so much for talking with me about this today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. Have a good night.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Bye.